Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and find the most important nuggets of knowledge. We're here to give you a shortcut to being well-informed on topics that matter.
And we aim to do it with surprising facts, enough context to make those aha moments really land, and maybe a little bit of humor without ever overwhelming you.
Exactly. Today, we're diving into a fascinating source you've shared with us, excerpts from Andrew Haywood's Political Ideologies, specifically zeroing in on socialism. This isn't just flipping through a dictionary. It's a deep look at an ideology that has profoundly shaped, well, the last couple of centuries, wouldn't you say? Sparked revolutions, built welfare states.
Oh, absolutely. And it continues to be debated fiercely today.
Right.
So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the core ideas, trace the historical development, and explore the many different paths socialism has taken. We want to help you cut through the noise and understand the sheer breadth and complexity contained within this single term.
Yeah, because it's definitely not just one thing.
Not at all. It is absolutely not a simple monolithic idea, and this source actually does a great job showing why.
So let's unpack this source and see what we can learn about socialism, from its linguistic roots, its early stirrings, all the way to its global challenges today. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning. Where does the term itself even come from? The source tells us socialist derives from the Latin word sociare,
Sociere. Okay.
which means to combine or to share. So that root word immediately tells you something fundamental about its focus. Togetherness, association, collective action.
Sharing and combining. Makes sense.
Yeah, and the earliest known usage pops up in 1827 in the UK, specifically in the Cooperative magazine.
Ah, a magazine about cooperation using the term socialist. That fits.
It fits perfectly.
Right.
And it didn't take long to catch on. By the early 1830s, you had followers of figures like Robert Owen in the UK.
He founded those experimental communities, didn't he?
Exactly, the utopian cooperative ones. And Saint-Simon in France, another influential early thinker. Well, their followers were already using the term to describe their beliefs.
Okay.
And by the 1840s, the term was familiar across the rapidly industrializing countries of Europe, France, Belgium, the German states. Its spread kind of seems to mirror the spread of industrialization itself.
Okay, so the term arrives alongside the Industrial Revolution, these early cooperative movements. But what is socialism fundamentally about? The source defines it significantly by its traditional opposition to capitalism.
Yes, that's crucial.
It's presented not just as like a slightly different economic system, but as an attempt to provide a more humane and socially worthwhile alternative.
That's a key phrase there. It suggests socialism isn't just about tweaking economics. It's proposing a fundamentally different way of organizing society.
Yeah.
And it's driven by a critique of how capitalism impacts human beings and their interactions.
Right. And that brings us to the core socialist vision of human beings themselves. What does the source say is the central idea about human nature here?
Well, the core socialist idea, and this might surprise some people, isn't primarily about the economy. It's actually about, well, anthropology, the view of the human being. The source says humans are fundamentally social creatures, united by a common humanity.
Social creatures.
Yeah, and that's a crucial departure point from ideologies that might emphasize, say, individual self-sufficiency above all else. It highlights the belief that individual identity isn't seen as fixed or solely intrinsic from birth, but is profoundly shaped by social interaction, by membership in groups, and by collective bodies like communities, even nations.
So my identity, my skills, my outlook, they're not just mine. Intrinsically, they're heavily molded by the society and groups I belong to.
That's the core argument, yes. And the implication of that is quite radical, really. If our identity and behavior are primarily formed by our social context, then the focus of politics and social organization should be on creating a society that shapes individuals in positive ways.
How so?
By fostering cooperation, community, and shared well-being, rather than just, letting individualism run rampant.
And springing directly from that view of human nature as social, it makes sense that socialists prefer cooperation to competition. The source frames cooperation as the natural and beneficial relationship between people.
Right. Think about it logically.
Yeah.
If we're social animals, doesn't working together make more inherent sense than constantly competing against each other?
Seems intuitive when you put it like that.
The source argues that competition actively pits individuals against each other, encourages them to ignore their social bonds, and promotes things like selfishness and aggression. Cooperation, on the other hand, well, it's argued to make both moral and economic sense.
How does it make economic sense?
Well, morally, Individuals develop empathy, caring, affection. Economically, the combined energy of a community working together can potentially achieve more than isolated individuals fighting over scraps.
Right.
The source even mentions the Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin, who suggested our species survived and prospered largely due to our capacity for mutual aid, inherent cooperation.
Mutual aid. That feels very linked to the core socialist value the source identifies as being perhaps the most defining one, equality.
Absolutely. It flows naturally. The source calls social equality, or sometimes equality of outcome, the defining feature of socialist ideology.
And that's distinct from other kinds of equality.
Very distinct. This is where it really carves out its unique space compared to, say, liberal ideas of just formal equality. Everyone follows the same rules, or equality of opportunity, everyone gets a shot. Social equality, in this context, means aiming for people's actual material circumstances where their life chances to be similar, or at least significantly closer than they tend to be under capitalism.
Okay, aiming for similar outcomes. And why is that the key goal? The source gives a few reasons, doesn't it?
Yes, it outlines three main arguments for why socialists prioritize social equality. The first is basically justice or fairness.
Okay.
Socialists are generally skeptical that the vast inequalities in wealth and status we see are simply due to differences in innate individual ability.
They don't think it's just talent.
Not primarily. They argue that society's structure itself creates much of the inequality. Just as capitalism fosters competition, the system is set up in a way that generates unequal results. Now, they don't deny individual differences exist, obviously. People have different skills, but they believe the most significant inequalities stem from unequal treatment by society and the massively unequal starting points the system creates.
So, justice demands.
Justice demands people are treated more equally by society in terms of their rewards and material circumstances. Formal equality, same rules for all, is seen as inadequate because it completely ignores these underlying structural disadvantages.
And equality of opportunity.
That's criticized quite harshly, actually. It's often seen as a way to legitimize inequality. It creates this myth that if you fail, it's solely your fault because you had the chance, completely ignoring the fact that the chances were never truly equal to begin with for everyone.
Ah, right. That reminds me of R.H. Tawney's famous tadpole philosophy quote the source mentions.
Exactly. That's such a great analogy. Tawney dismissed equality of opportunity with that, saying only a tiny fraction of tadpoles ever actually become frogs.
Meaning most are destined not to make it, regardless of potential.
Precisely. It's a powerful way of saying that even if everyone starts in the same pond, the system itself is structured so that only a tiny, perhaps lucky minority will ever reach the top. The vast majority are effectively left behind by the structure of the pond itself.
Okay, so fairness is argument one. What's the second?
The second argument for social equality is that it underpins community and cooperation. The idea is simple. If people share more equal social circumstances, they're seen as more likely to identify with each other, build solidarity, and work together for the common good.
Inequality divides, equality unites.
Basically, yes. Inequality, conversely, breeds resentment, conflict, and instability. The source explicitly notes that socialists criticize equality of opportunity precisely because it fosters that survival of the fittest mentality we talked about,
Right.
which actively undermines social cohesion and community feeling.
Okay. And the third argument?
The third argument is linked to need satisfaction. Socialists generally believe that satisfying basic human needs is the absolute foundation for human fulfillment and self-realization.
Needs versus wants.
Exactly. A need isn't just something you'd like. It's a necessity: food, shelter, clean water, healthcare, companionship, education. For socialists, having these basic needs met isn't just about basic comfort. It's fundamental to true freedom.
That's a really different way of defining freedom than just, say, political liberty or freedom from government interference, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Freedom isn't just being free from external constraints. It's being free to live a dignified human life and actually develop your potential. Having your basic needs unmet is seen as a fundamental unfreedom.
Makes sense.
And Marx captured this in his famous, though perhaps idealistic, communist theory of distribution, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
Right.
Since everyone has broadly similar basic needs, distributing resources based on need has inherently egalitarian implications. The source does add a little caveat, though.
Oh.
Recognizing special needs, like those arising from disability or particular health conditions, means need satisfaction isn't absolutely egalitarian in practice. Some might legitimately require more resources than others to meet their needs.
I see. So even on this core value of equality, there are disagreements within socialism itself. It's not monolithic even here.
Oh, absolutely not. This is crucial. While socialists broadly agree on the virtue of social and economic equality, they disagree significantly on the extent it should be pursued and, critically, the means used to achieve it.
And this links back to that fundamental split you mentioned earlier.
Exactly, it's that core division. On one side, you have Marxists and communists representing a more, let's say, fundamentalist wing. They typically aim for absolute social equality, which they believe requires abolishing private property and productive wealth entirely and creating a system of common ownership.
Abolish private ownership of factories, land, etc.
Essentially, yes, productive wealth. On the other side, you have social democrats. They tend to be more revisionist. They aim for relative social equality, narrowing the gap, reducing inequalities primarily through state action, like redistributing wealth via the welfare state and progressive taxation.
So they work within a system that still has private property.
Yes. Their approach accepts that some material incentives will likely remain, and their focus on need satisfaction is largely geared towards eradicating poverty and ensuring a basic standard of living, rather than achieving complete equality of outcome across the board.
Okay, that distinction is really important. And the source includes that really helpful summary box comparing how different ideologies view equality.
Yes, that's very useful.
It's a great snapshot for you listening to see where socialism sits relative to liberalism, conservatism, anarchism, and others on this key concept. We won't walk through every single comparison right now, but definitely check that out in the source material if you have it.
Okay, next core theme, class politics. Historically, class has been viewed by socialists as the deepest and most politically significant social division.
More important than, say, nation or religion.
Traditionally, yes, for many socialists. The source describes this focus on class as having two main expressions within socialism. First, it's used as an analytical tool.
A way of understanding society.
Exactly. Socialists, especially Marxists, believe that in capitalist societies, people tend to think and act collectively based on their common economic position or interest. Social classes, not just individuals, are seen as the main historical actors, and class conflict is the key driving force behind social and political change. The Marxist belief that all history is the history of class struggle is the most prominent example of this analytical use.
Okay, so class explains history. What's the second expression?
The second expression is the political focus on the working class itself. Socialism has often seen itself or presented itself as the authentic voice and political expression of the interests of the industrial working class.
The party of the workers.
Right, and the working class has been viewed as the primary vehicle, the historical agent, through which socialism will ultimately be achieved and capitalism overthrown. The ideal outcome here is eventually a classless society, or at least one with dramatically reduced class divisions.
How does that work?
The idea is that in the process of the working class emancipating itself from capitalist exploitation, it simultaneously sheds its own limited class identity, and its members become fully developed, well-rounded human beings, free from the constraints of class definition.
But again, I suspect there were different ideas about what class even meant within socialism.
Definitely. You see that division again. Within the Marxist tradition, class is defined pretty strictly by your economic relationship to the means of production.
Own or work?
Basically. Do you own productive wealth, capital, or do you have to sell your labor power to survive? This creates the two fundamental antagonistic classes, the bourgeoisie, the owners, and the proletariat, the wage laborers. Their interests are seen as fundamentally irreconcilable, leading inevitably, Marx argued, to conflict and revolution.
And the Social Democrats?
Social Democrats tend to define class more broadly, often based on factors like income, status, lifestyle, and occupation. They distinguish, for instance, between white-collar middle classes and blue-collar working classes. Their political goal isn't usually revolution based on this division, but rather narrowing the gaps between these different strata through state intervention, promoting social amelioration and class harmony, rather than inevitable conflict.
Okay. And the source notes that this strong traditional link between socialism and specifically working class politics has declined quite significantly since the mid-20th century. Why did that happen?
It's largely seen as a consequence of major economic shifts, particularly deindustrialization in many advanced capitalist economies.
The decline of heavy industry.
Exactly. The traditional base of many socialist parties, those urban manual workers in factories, mines, shipyards, has shrunk dramatically in relative terms. This has inevitably weakened traditional forms of class solidarity based on that shared experience.
So parties had to adapt.
They had to. As a result, socialist parties have been forced to broaden their appeal beyond this shrinking base, trying to win over middle-class voters or form wider political coalitions. This has also pushed them, ideologically, to redefine what being radical means. Increasingly, it's focused less on classic class emancipation and more on other progressive issues like gender equality, environmental sustainability, peace movements, and international development.
Interesting shift. Okay, the final core theme identified is common ownership. This seems like a really big one, fundamentally setting socialism apart.
It really is. Socialists, as we touched on when discussing equality, tend to trace the root causes of competition, inequality, and social conflict back to the institution of private property. Specifically, the private ownership of productive wealth, the things you use to create more wealth, like factories, land, capital.
And this is a core difference from liberalism and conservatism.
A fundamental difference, yes. Liberals and conservatives generally see private property as a natural right, essential for freedom and prosperity. Socialists have traditionally been highly critical of it.
So, what are the specific criticisms of private property the source highlights? Why is it seen as problematic?
It outlines three main reasons. First, it's seen as unjust. The argument is that wealth isn't really created by isolated individuals. It's produced by the collective effort of human labor working together. Therefore, socialists argue, the wealth generated should be owned by the community that collectively produced it, not by private individuals who happen to own the means of production.
Okay, wealth is social, so ownership should be social.
That's the idea. Second, socialists traditionally believe private property breeds acquisitiveness and is morally corrupting.
How so?
The constant pursuit of private wealth is seen as fostering materialism, making people believe that happiness comes primarily from accumulating possessions. Owners inevitably want more, and those without property feel compelled to acquire it, leading to an unhealthy focus on material gain over other human values. Third, it's seen as inherently divisive. Private property, in this view, inevitably creates fundamental conflicts of interest within society between owners and workers, employers and employees, the rich and the poor. These are seen as inherent antagonisms built right into the economic structure based on private ownership.
So given these criticisms, what was the proposed socialist solution regarding property?
Well, based on these criticisms, the socialist response has historically been either the outright abolition of private property and productive wealth, replacing it with some form of common or collective ownership, or, at the very least, significantly curtailing private property rights and balancing them against the broader interests of the community.
Again, a spectrum of views.
Exactly. The more fundamentalist socialists, like Marx and Engels, absolutely aimed for the complete abolition of private property in the means of production. They envisioned a future classless, communist society where productive resources would be owned collectively by all and used for the benefit of all humanity.
Did they say how that would work?
That's the interesting thing. The source points out they were surprisingly vague on the practical details. They wrote a lot about why private property should be abolished, but much less about the specific institutional structure of common ownership or how it would function day to day.
So what happened when people tried to implement this in practice, like in the Soviet Union?
Well, the practical implementations we saw in places like the Soviet Union looked quite different from that perhaps fuzzy theoretical ideal. Orthodox communism, under leaders like Lenin and especially Stalin, essentially translated the idea of common ownership into state ownership.
The government owned everything.
Pretty much. After the Bolsheviks seized power, they began nationalizing industries, taking private assets under the control of the state. Stalin completed this process with his forced collectivization of agriculture and comprehensive state control over industry in the 1930s, creating a centrally planned economy. So what was officially termed common ownership or socialist state property in Soviet ideology effectively meant the state bureaucracy controlled the economy.
And the source distinguishes this.
Yes. The source makes a clear distinction between this reality of state socialism, where the state apparatus holds economic power, and the more diffuse, perhaps democratic idea of genuine collective ownership that Marx might have originally envisioned.
Okay. Now, social democrats operating within democratic capitalist systems also use the state in relation to ownership, but in a much more limited and different way, right?
Exactly. Their approach wasn't comprehensive state collectivization. Instead, they aimed to build what became known as a mixed economy.
A mix of public and private.
Precisely. A combination of public ownership, often through nationalization of key sectors, and private enterprise. A classic example mentioned is the post-war Labour government under Clement Attlee in the UK. They selectively nationalized the so-called commanding heights of the economy, major utilities like coal, steel, railways, electricity, gas.
Why those specific ones?
The idea was partly to ensure essential services were run for public benefit, not just private profit, and partly to give the government levers to regulate the wider economy. But crucially, they left the vast majority of manufacturing, retail, and other industries firmly in private hands.
And has that focus on nationalization remained central for Social Democrats?
Less so over time. The source notes that since the 1950s, parliamentary socialist parties in the West have increasingly distanced themselves from this politics of ownership. They found nationalization wasn't always popular or efficient, and they began to define socialism less by the extent of state ownership and more through the pursuit of social justice and equality via other means, like the welfare state and taxation.
So a shift in emphasis.
A definite shift. And again, the source provides another valuable summary box, this time comparing different ideologies' perspectives on the economy, the role of the market versus the state, preferred ownership models, and so on. Again, we won't detail every single point, but it reinforces how distinct the socialist approach to property in the economy is, even considering all the internal variations and historical changes we've discussed.
Okay, so we've really unpacked the core ideas or the ends of socialism: community, cooperation, equality, class, ownership. Now let's shift focus slightly to the means, the different paths or roads to socialism that have been proposed or taken. The source emphasizes this isn't just a trivial difference in strategy, is it?
Not at all. The road taken, the methods used, profoundly shaped the character of the socialist movement itself, and, critically, the form of socialism that might eventually emerge. Means and ends are deeply intertwined here.
Right. So let's start with one major road: revolutionary socialism.
Okay. Many early socialists, and indeed many throughout the 20th century, believed that achieving socialism required the violent overthrow of the existing political and economic system. They saw revolution, often involving violence, as necessary or inevitable.
Who advocated this?
You had figures like Auguste Blanqui in France, who advocated for a small, disciplined group of conspirators to seize power in a coup. More famously, Marx and Engels theorized about a larger-scale proletarian revolution led by the organized, class-conscious working masses rising up against their capitalist oppressors.
And did this happen often?
Well, there were many revolutionary uprisings and attempts, but the first successful revolution carried out explicitly in the name of socialism wasn't until 1917 in Russia. Led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the source actually describes it as more of a coup d'etat than a broad popular uprising in the initial stages. But it undoubtedly became a powerful, influential model for revolutionaries around the world for decades.
And why did revolution seem like the necessary path, especially back in the 19th century? Why not just try to reform the system from within?
The source gives two main compelling reasons for this belief at the time. First, the sheer, undeniable, brutal injustice of early industrial capitalism. We've touched on this: the grinding poverty, the dangerous working conditions, the child labor, the constant threat of unemployment. Capitalism was widely perceived by those experiencing its sharp end as naked oppression and exploitation.
So conditions were ripe.
To many observers, the working class literally seemed on the brink of revolution. You have to remember, Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, a year absolutely rocked by widespread popular revolts across Europe. The idea of revolution wasn't some abstract academic theory. It felt like a real immediate possibility, even a necessity.
Okay, extreme conditions. What was the second reason?
The second reason, and this is critical, was that the working classes generally had very few, if any, alternative means of achieving political influence.
No vote, no voice.
Largely, yes. They were mostly excluded from formal political life. In places where constitutional government existed, the right to vote, the suffrage, was often restricted by property qualifications, effectively limiting it to the middle and upper classes. So if you have no voice within the existing system, if the system seems designed to ignore or oppress you, then violent overthrow might feel like the only viable path to achieving fundamental change.
And this belief in revolution wasn't just born from practical conditions. It also stemmed from a specific view of the state itself, didn't it?
Precisely. This is a key difference from, say, the liberal view. Unlike liberals who might see the state as a potentially neutral arbiter acting for the common good, revolutionary socialists, particularly Marxists, saw the state fundamentally as an instrument of class oppression.
The state serves the rich.
Essentially, yes. They viewed the existing state as a bourgeois state, inherently biased towards protecting the interests of capital and the property-owning class against the interests of labor. From this perspective, attempts at political reform or gradual change within that state structure were seen as fundamentally pointless, even a delusion.
Even elections.
Yes, even gaining the right to vote and participating in elections were sometimes dismissed, particularly by more radical Marxists, as a facade, a way to create the illusion of popular control while hiding the reality of unequal economic power, and a way to misdirect working-class energy into channels that wouldn't actually threaten the system. So the logical conclusion from this viewpoint was clear. A class-conscious proletariat had no real choice but to forcibly overthrow the bourgeois state in order to build a genuinely socialist society.
And this revolutionary approach didn't just stay in 19th century Europe, did it? It continued much later, particularly in the developing world.
Absolutely. After World War II, faith in revolution remained very strong among socialists and nationalists in many parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Many national liberation movements fighting against colonial rule embraced the idea of arms struggle.
Why then?
They often believed, rightly or wrongly, that the colonial powers would simply never concede independence or allow fundamental social change peacefully. Violence was seen as the only language the oppressors understood. So you see this revolutionary path shaping major historical events like the Chinese Revolution under Mao Zedong, which was the culmination of a long military campaign.
And others?
The Vietnam War, Che Guevara's guerrilla campaigns across Latin America following the Cuban Revolution, the Sandinistas' overthrow of the Somoza regime in Nicaragua, Algeria's bloody war for independence from France. These were all profoundly shaped by the belief that fundamental change against an entrenched power structure required taking up arms.
Now, this revolutionary path, while perhaps born from desperation or conviction, had significant and often very negative consequences, as the source points out.
Yes, tragically so in many cases. The source notes it usually led revolutionaries, once in power, to pursue fundamentalist ends, attempting to completely obliterate the old order and build entirely new social and economic systems from scratch, often with immense human cost.
Like the Khmer Rouge.
The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia is an extreme and horrific example, literally declaring year zero after seizing power, signifying a complete break with the past. And more broadly, the revolutionary road was very often associated, the source argues, with a drift towards dictatorship and the use of political repression.
That seems like such a terrible irony, movements fighting for liberation, ending up creating new forms of oppression. Why did that happen so often?
The source suggests several interconnected reasons. First, the very reliance on violence and military struggle to achieve power meant the new rulers became accustomed to seeing force as a legitimate, even primary, tool of government policy. Mao Zedong's famous quote, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun," kind of captures this mindset.
Power corrupts.
Perhaps. Second, revolutionary parties often had to adopt highly centralized, disciplined military-style structures to succeed in their struggle. These hierarchical structures, with strong leadership and strict obedience, were then often consolidated and maintained after they gained state power, stifling internal dissent. Third, the process of thoroughly rooting out the old order, eliminating perceived class enemies, counter-revolutionaries, or political opponents, often meant suppressing all opposition, paving the way for one-party states and sometimes totalitarian dictatorships.
A grim outcome.
A very grim outcome compared to the initial ideals of liberation and equality. And the source argues that this whole revolutionary socialist tradition, particularly the Leninist model, was fatally undermined by the dramatic collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe in the counter-revolutions of 1989-91.
The fall of the Berlin Wall and all that.
Exactly. That historical moment effectively ended the fundamental split in the international socialist movement that had begun way back with the 1917 Russian Revolution. According to the source, it completed the conversion of socialism to constitutional and democratic politics in the mainstream. Though, as the source also notes, pockets of revolutionary socialist insurgency do still survive in certain parts of the world, like the Maoist movements mentioned in Peru and Nepal at the time of writing.
Okay, so with the revolutionary road largely discredited or abandoned by mainstream socialism, that brings us squarely to the other major path, evolutionary socialism, the gradual approach.
Right. As we touched on, enthusiasm for popular revolt and violent revolution began to wane in the more advanced capitalist states towards the end of the 19th century. This wasn't just a change of heart, it reflected changing realities.
What changed?
Capitalism itself matured. It wasn't quite the brutal, chaotic system of the early Industrial Revolution. Working-class living conditions, while still often poor, gradually began to improve. Wages rose, working hours sometimes shortened, and the urban working class started to lose some of its purely oppositional revolutionary character. They became more integrated into industrial society through the growth of institutions like trade unions, working-class political parties, cooperatives, and social clubs.
They gained a stake in the system.
To some extent, yes. And critically, alongside this economic and social integration came the gradual advance of political democracy. The most significant development here was the extension of the franchise, the right to vote progressively to working-class men and eventually women.
So gaining the vote changed the calculation.
It changed the calculation fundamentally for many socialists. By World War I, universal manhood suffrage was common in many Western states, and the movement for women's suffrage was gaining ground. These factors combined led many socialists to shift away from planning violent insurrection and towards exploring an alternative, an evolutionary, democratic, or parliamentary road to socialism.
Using the system to change the system.
Precisely. Maybe we don't need to smash the state. Maybe we can capture it through the ballot box and use its existing mechanisms to implement socialist reforms gradually and peacefully. A key early example of this parliamentary socialist approach discussed in the source is the Fabian Society in the UK, founded way back in 1884.
Figures like George Bernard Shaw, the Webbs.
Exactly, prominent intellectuals. They famously took their name from the Roman general Fabius Maximus, who was known for his patient, cautious, gradualist tactics rather than decisive battles. This reflected their core belief that socialism would and should develop naturally and peacefully out of liberal capitalism through steady, incremental change, not sudden upheaval.
And how would they achieve this?
Their strategy involved two main prongs. First, political action. They advocated forming a distinct socialist party to compete for power within the existing parliamentary system. This was a crucial break from revolutionary Marxism because it involved accepting the liberal theory of the state, viewing it as a potentially neutral arbiter that could be used by whoever won elections, rather than inherently a tool of class oppression. The Webbs, in fact, were instrumental figures in the founding of the British Labour Party.
So, work through Parliament. What was the second prong?
Education and persuasion. They believed in permeating the existing elite groups, politicians, senior civil servants, scientists, academics with socialist ideas. The goal was to convince these influential people, through rational argument and moral appeal, that socialism was not only morally superior, often drawing on Christian ethical principles, but also more rational and efficient than laissez-faire capitalism.
Spreading the ideas gradually.
Spreading the ideas, winning hearts and minds, especially among those in positions to influence policy. This Fabian gradualist approach had a significant influence, not just in Britain, but also on socialist parties elsewhere, like the German Social Democratic Party, SPD, founded in 1875.
The SPD became huge, didn't it?
It became the largest and arguably most influential socialist party in Europe before World War I. While it had Marxist roots, it increasingly adopted a reformist parliamentary approach. It was influenced by thinkers like Ferdinand Lassalle, who argued that the democratic state could be made to respond to working-class interests through political pressure and gradual social reform enacted by what he saw as a potentially benign state.
And Edward Bernstein was key here, too.
Absolutely pivotal. Edward Bernstein, a leading SPD theorist, developed these reformist ideas systematically in his highly controversial book, Evolutionary Socialism, published in 1898. It was a major revision, some said rejection, of orthodox Marxism.
What was his core argument?
Bernstein conducted detailed empirical research into how capitalism was actually developing, and he argued forcefully that Marx's core predictions were proving wrong. Capitalism wasn't collapsing under its own contradictions, it was proving surprisingly stable and flexible. Society wasn't polarizing into just two warring classes, ownership was actually widening through things like joint stock companies, and a substantial growing middle class of salaried employees, technicians, and managers was emerging.
So the picture was more complex than Marx foresaw.
Much more complex. Bernstein concluded that capitalism was no longer the system of naked class oppression Marx had described. Therefore, the call for violent revolution was redundant and unnecessary. Instead, he argued, capitalism could be gradually transformed or reformed from within, peacefully and democratically.
How?
Through the working class using its growing political power via the ballot box to elect socialist governments that would then implement reforms like nationalization of major industries, legal protection for workers' rights, and the development of welfare programs to improve workers' lives.
And this principle of gradualism caught on.
It really did. This reformist, evolutionary principle came to dominate most mainstream working-class parties in countries like Australia, Britain, Italy, France, and Scandinavia around the turn of the century and into the 20th century. It became the dominant strategy for achieving socialist goals in democratic societies. It even influenced, as the source notes, some Western communist parties much later, in the 1970s, leading to the phenomenon of Eurocommunism, which tried to blend Marxist analysis with a commitment to liberal democratic principles and pursuing a peaceful democratic road to socialism.
This whole period of democratic socialist advance seems characterized by a huge amount of optimism, doesn't it? The source captures this with the Fabian phrase, the inevitability of gradualism.
Yes, that phrase perfectly summed up the prevailing mood of hope and confidence among many evolutionary socialists. They genuinely believed that the victory of socialism was historically inevitable. But unlike Marx's inevitability, which was driven by violent class conflict and economic crisis, their inevitability was driven by what they saw as the inherent logic of the democratic process itself.
What was the logic? How did they think it would work?
Their optimism rested on a chain of assumptions. First, they assumed that the extension of the right to vote would inevitably lead to universal suffrage and therefore genuine political equality. One person, one vote.
Okay.
Second, they assumed that political equality would naturally work in favor of the majority class, which in industrial societies was clearly the working class. Numbers would translate into power. Third, they assumed that socialism was the natural political home for the working class, that oppressed and exploited workers would naturally be drawn to vote for socialist parties representing their interests. Fourth, they assumed that once socialist parties were elected to power, they would be able and willing to use that power to fundamentally transform society through a steady process of legislative reform. Put all those assumptions together, and the conclusion seemed inescapable. Peaceful, democratic socialism wasn't just possible, it was inevitable.
Sounds so neat and tidy, but the source then delivers the punchline. These optimistic expectations have, however, not been borne out in reality.
Yeah, history didn't quite follow the script. It turned out to be much messier and more complicated. While socialist and social democratic parties have certainly held government office, often for long periods, in most liberal democracies, with the notable exception, as the source points out, of North America, their path to power wasn't guaranteed or inevitable just because of working-class numbers.
They didn't always win.
They didn't always win. And even when they did, they rarely commanded the absolute consistent majorities the theory predicted. The source mentions the Swedish Social Democrats as perhaps the most successful example, but notes even they only once achieved over 50% of the vote on their own. And crucially, while these parties, when in power, introduced significant and often beneficial reforms, building welfare states, managing economies, improving workers' rights, the source argues they didn't actually preside over any fundamental social transformation. Capitalism was reformed, often significantly, but it was not abolished. The underlying structures remained.
So why didn't it work out as planned? Did democratic socialism encounter problems the early theorists hadn't fully anticipated?
Yes, several significant problems emerged that challenged those initial optimistic assumptions. First, the core assumption that the industrial working class would constitute a permanent and growing majority of the electorate in advanced capitalist societies proved questionable over the long term.
Deindustrialization again.
Deindustrialization played a huge role. The decline of traditional heavy industries led to a shrinking of the traditional urban, manual working class, the bedrock support for many socialist parties.
Yeah.
At the same time, you saw the growth of white-collar service sector jobs and increasing affluence for many, leading to some called two-thirds, one-third societies. Meaning a large majority, maybe two-thirds, enjoy reasonable economic security and comfort, while poverty and disadvantage become concentrated in a smaller underclass, maybe one-third often excluded from the mainstream economy. The source mentions J.K. Galbraith's influential book, The Culture of Contentment, published in 1992, which argued that this emerging contented majority benefiting from the status quo tends towards political conservatism, making them less receptive to radical change.
And the consequence for socialist parties?
The consequence was often declining electoral support among their traditional base, and a realization they needed to appeal much more broadly to middle-class voters or form coalitions with other parties. This inevitably required them to modify their ideological commitments and moderate their policies to gain wider acceptance.
Okay, so the changing class structure was one problem. What else?
A second major challenge was the assumption that the working class, even when it existed in large numbers, was inherently or consistently socialist, or that socialism was definitively perceived to be in their best interests.
They didn't always vote socialist.
No. Capitalism, especially during the long post-World War II economic boom, proved surprisingly capable of delivering the goods for large sections of the working population, rising living standards, consumer goods, job security for a time. As workers became more affluent, their political priorities sometimes shifted. As early as the 1950s, socialist parties were revising policies to appeal to these increasingly prosperous workers, moving away from radical demands like widespread nationalization towards focusing on welfare and economic management.
And more recently.
And since the 1980s, dealing with the changing class structure, globalization, and the rise of neoliberal ideas, mainstream socialism in many countries has become increasingly associated with trying to manage the market economy effectively, perhaps making it fairer at the margins, rather than fundamentally re-engineering capitalism's social structure.
Now, some socialists on the left have a different explanation for why the working class hasn't consistently embraced radical socialism. They point to something other than just economic success or changing demographics, don't they?
Yes, they often emphasize the role of ideological manipulation or cultural factors. This goes back to Marx himself.
How so?
The Marxist idea is that bourgeois ideology, the values and beliefs that support the capitalist system, pervade society through institutions like the media, education, religion, etc. This ideology, it's argued, prevents workers from fully recognizing the extent of their own exploitation and achieving true class consciousness.
They don't see the reality.
Or their perception is clouded. Lenin took this further, arguing that without the guidance of a dedicated revolutionary party, the working class on its own would only achieve trade union consciousness, meaning they'd focus on pragmatic goals like better wages and working conditions within the capitalist system, rather than developing the full revolutionary class consciousness needed to overthrow it. He saw the party's role as essential to awaken that revolutionary potential.
And Gramsci.
Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, developed this idea further with his concept of ideological hegemony. He argued that capitalism maintains its dominance not just through economic power or state force, but crucially through the spiritual and cultural supremacy of the ruling class. This hegemony is spread through the institutions of civil society, media, churches, schools, even trade unions, sometimes shaping people's common sense understandings of the world in ways that reinforce the existing order and make radical alternatives seem unnatural or impossible.
So it's a battle of ideas, not just economics.
A crucial battle of ideas, yes. And finally, even if socialist parties do manage to overcome these electoral and ideological hurdles and get elected, the source raises a critical question. Can they actually carry out fundamental reforms once in office?
They face obstacles.
They face potentially huge obstacles from entrenched interests, both within the state apparatus and in the broader society. The source quotes Karl Kautsky, a leading German social democrat, who observed back in 1902, "The capitalist class rules, but it does not govern. It contents itself with ruling the government."
What does that mean?
It suggests that even if socialists win elections, the real power might still lie elsewhere with the owners of capital. Political elites within the state administration, the judiciary, the military, often share the same social background and worldview as business elites, creating a kind of institutional resistance to radical change. Plus, any elected government, regardless of its ideology, has to respect the power of big business. Because big business controls investment, jobs, and often significant political influence through lobbying and donations. Governments that seriously threaten business interests risk capital flight, economic disruption, and intense political opposition. The danger, the source concludes, is that socialist parties can win office without necessarily acquiring power. The real power needed to enact truly fundamental social transformation against entrenched opposition.
That's a sobering thought for democratic socialists. Okay, let's focus now more closely on social democracy itself, particularly as it's solidified as a distinct tradition in the mid-20th century. We've established its embrace of parliamentary means, but you mentioned it also involved a significant revision of the ultimate goals, right?
Yes, this is key to understanding what social democracy became. Most mainstream Western socialist parties, over time, effectively abandoned the original revolutionary goal of completely abolishing capitalism. Instead, their practical aim became to reform or humanize capitalism.
Tame the beast, not slay it.
That's a good way to put it. So social democracy came to represent a kind of pragmatic compromise, seeking a balance between a dynamic market economy on one hand and state intervention on the other, aimed at achieving greater social justice and security.
And this became dominant for a while.
It really did, especially in the decades after World War II. This approach created what's often called a social democratic consensus in many Western European states. Key elements were the mixed economy, comprehensive welfare states, and Keynesian economic management aimed at full employment. It seemed like a successful formula for a long time.
But it faced challenges later on.
Yes, as the source notes, from the 1970s and 80s onwards, this classic social democracy struggled. It faced pressure from the resurgence of free market ideas, neoliberalism, and profound economic changes like globalization, leading to something of an ideological retreat or rethinking.
And you mentioned earlier that this form of socialism often drew on different philosophical roots than traditional Marxism, not purely scientific or materialist.
Exactly. The theoretical underpinnings for social democracy often came from moral or even religious beliefs, what the source terms ethical socialism. Instead of relying solely on Marx's analysis of historical laws and economic contradictions, ethical socialists offered primarily a moral critique of capitalism.
Capitalism is unfair or unethical.
Precisely. Socialism was portrayed as morally superior because it aligns better with the view of humans as fundamentally ethical creatures, bound together by ties of love, sympathy, compassion, and fellowship. This drew on long traditions of humanist socialist thought figures like Fourier, Owen, William Morris in the UK, but also, very significantly, on religious principles, particularly Christianity.
Christian social.
Yes. There's a strong tradition, especially in Britain. Thinkers like R.H. Tawney, who we mentioned earlier, based their socialism explicitly on Christian morality rather than Marxist class analysis. Tawney emphasized universal brotherhood, the principle of loving thy neighbor, and famously condemned capitalism in his book The Acquisitive Society because he believed it was driven by the inherently unchristian sin of avarice rather than a faith in our common humanity.
And this connection between faith and social justice wasn't just a Western thing.
Not at all. The source mentions liberation theology, which became influential among some Catholics, particularly in the developing world and Latin America from the 1960s onwards. Priests and theologians argued for a preferential option for the poor, leading many clergy to become actively involved in social and political struggles, sometimes supporting socialist or radical movements. Similarly, in many Muslim-majority countries, socialist ideas found resonance with Islam's strong emphasis on social justice, charity, cooperation, and its traditional prohibition of usury, charging excessive interest.
But did relying on ethics weaken socialism's theoretical edge?
The source suggests it might have. By shifting the primary justification from, say, Marx's claim to scientific analysis of history and economics towards more subjective moral or religious principles, social democracy arguably weakened the theoretical basis of socialism as a distinct, comprehensive, and universally applicable ideology. Its appeal became more culturally specific, perhaps.
So the main focus of ethical socialism, and thus much of social democracy, became achieving social justice, especially regarding the fair distribution of wealth.
Yes, that became the central practical and moral concern. But the term social justice itself, as used within social democracy, came to cover a very broad range of views. It could stretch from a more left-wing interpretation demanding significant extensions of equality and maybe collective ownership, all the way to a more right-wing interpretation prioritizing market efficiency and individual self-reliance, sometimes blurring the lines considerably with modern liberalism or even compassionate conservatism.
Okay, so these Western socialist parties became revisionist not just in their ethical grounding, but decisively in their practical politics. Even if their official party constitutions initially held on to fundamentalist goals, like UK Labour's original clause, the fourth commitment to common ownership.
Which called for the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange.
Right. Even with that on paper, in practice, they increasingly adopted pragmatic policies designed to manage and reform the existing market economy rather than replace it. And Edward Bernstein, whose evolutionary socialism we discussed, was the key figure providing the intellectual ammunition for this shift away from orthodox Marxism towards a practical reformist agenda.
Absolutely. His empirical observations were crucial. He looked closely at how capitalism was actually developing in the late 19th century and argued forcefully that Marx's core predictions just weren't coming true.
Remind us what he found.
He found capitalism was proving more stable and flexible than Marx predicted. Society wasn't inevitably polarizing into just two hostile classes. Ownership was actually widening through things like joint stock companies, and his significant growing middle class of white-collar workers, technicians, and managers was emerging between the traditional bourgeoisie and proletariat.
So it wasn't just owners versus workers anymore.
Exactly. The social structure was becoming more complex and differentiated. Bernstein concluded that capitalism was no longer, if it ever truly was, simply a system of naked class oppression. Therefore, the call for violent revolution was not only unnecessary, but also strategically wrong. Instead, he believed capitalism could be gradually reformed peacefully and democratically.
Through state action.
Yes, through the working class using its vote to elect socialist governments that would then implement reforms like nationalizing key industries, passing laws to protect workers' rights, and establishing welfare programs to provide Social Security and reduce inequality. So, with the revolutionary goal of comprehensive nationalization and central planning largely abandoned by mainstream social democracy, its practical political program coalesced around three more modest, achievable objectives that really defined it for much of the 20th century.
What were those three?
Objective 1, the mixed economy. We've discussed this, that pragmatic blend of public ownership, usually selective nationalization of the commanding heights or natural monopolies, and private enterprise. The goal wasn't state control of everything, but state influence and regulation within a predominantly market framework. The UK Attlee government is the classic example cited.
Okay, mixed economy. Number 2.
Objective 2, economic management. Social democrats came to believe strongly that the state needed to actively intervene to manage the capitalist economy, primarily to ensure stable economic growth and maintain full employment. After 1945, they almost universally adopted Keynesian economic techniques using government spending, taxation, and sometimes interest rates to steer the economy away from booms and busts.
And the third objective?
Objective 3, and perhaps the most distinctive and enduring achievement, the welfare state. This became the principal means by which social democracy sought to reform and humanize capitalism. The welfare state acts as a massive redistributive mechanism, using taxes collected primarily from the better off and profitable businesses to fund social benefits and services like healthcare, education, pensions, unemployment support, aimed at promoting social equality, eradicating poverty, and providing security for all citizens from cradle to grave. The idea wasn't to abolish capitalism, but to create a kinder, gentler version, a reformed or welfare capitalism where the state significantly cushioned people from the market's harshest effects and inequalities.
And Anthony Crosland's book, The Future of Socialism in 1956, was important in solidifying this vision.
Very important. It provided a key theoretical update of justification for this mid-century social democratic project, building on Bernstein, but addressing the realities of post-war capitalism.
What was Crosland's main argument?
Crosland argued that modern capitalism, the kind that existed in the 1950s, was fundamentally different from the 19th century model Marx had analyzed. The key change, he believed, was managerialism.
Managers running things, not owners.
Largely, yes. He argued that large corporations were now dominated by a new class of professional managers, technical experts, and technocrats, rather than the old-style capitalist owners. Ownership by shareholders had become largely divorced from control, exercised by salaried managers. These managers, he suggested, had broader goals than just maximizing profit for absent owners, things like company growth, stability, maybe even social responsibility.
And the implication of this?
The implication, for Crosland, was that traditional Marxist analysis focused on the irreconcilable conflict between owners and workers was simply irrelevant to this new reality. Capitalism was no longer primarily about class exploitation in the old sense, which meant that traditional socialist remedies like widespread nationalization and central planning were outdated and unnecessary.
So if socialism wasn't about ownership anymore, what was it about for Crosland?
Crosland essentially reframed socialism. It became, for him, primarily the politics of social justice and equality, pursued mainly through wealth redistribution via the welfare state, which would be funded by progressive taxation levied on the profits generated by a managed capitalist economy.
And economic growth was key to this.
Absolutely crucial. Crosland stressed that continued economic growth was essential for the success of social democracy. Why? Because a growing economy generates the increasing tax revenues needed to fund expanding welfare programs and public services. Furthermore, he argued, prosperous citizens are more likely to tolerate and even support high taxes funding benefits for the needy if their own living standards are also demonstrably rising. Growth makes redistribution politically palatable.
So for several decades, especially during the post-war boom, it looked like social democracy really had found a winning formula. Harnessed the dynamism of the market economy, but used the state to manage it, ensure full employment, and redistribute wealth to achieve greater equality and security. A golden age, some called it. But the source talks about a crisis emerging later.
Yes, it seemed like a stable and successful model for quite some time. But the source argues that this Keynesian social democracy was perhaps built on an inherently unstable compromise.
What was the compromise?
It was a pragmatic acceptance of the market economy, recognizing it as the only reliable engine for generating wealth. As no viable socialist alternative had emerged, combined with a persistent socialist ethic demanding social justice, distributive equality, and the reduction of poverty and inequality.
So efficiency versus equality.
Exactly. There was always an underlying tension between the demands of economic efficiency, often associated with market mechanisms, and the goals of egalitarianism, often requiring state intervention and redistribution. This inherent conflict was largely masked or manageable during the long period of economic prosperity after World War II, the long boom years.
Why then?
Because sustained economic growth, low unemployment, and relatively low inflation meant that pretty much everyone's living standards were rising. The expanding economic pie made it easier to finance generous welfare states and achieve redistribution without making politically powerful groups feel like they were losing out significantly.
But the boom didn't last forever.
No. The economic difficulties that hit Western economies in the 1970s and 80s, slower growth, rising inflation, stagflation, increased unemployment, brutally exposed this underlying tension. It led to what became known as the fiscal crisis of the welfare state. Meaning rising unemployment simultaneously increased the demand for welfare benefits, more people needing support, while sluggish growth and lower profits squeezed the tax revenues needed to pay for them. This created an acute political and economic dilemma for social democratic governments.
Which dilemma?
Should they prioritize restoring market efficiency, which might mean cutting inflation, maybe reducing taxes on business, potentially curbing union power even if it hurt the poor, or increased inequality in the short term? Or should they prioritize defending the poor and maintaining social cohesion by maintaining or even expanding welfare programs, even if it meant higher taxes, bigger deficits? Absolutely. The economic problems were compounded by those political, social, and international factors we discussed earlier. The electoral viability of traditional social democracy was undermined by deindustrialization and the shrinking of its core working-class base. Political power seemed to be shifting towards Galbraith's contented majority, who were perhaps less interested in traditional social democratic appeals.
Leading to electoral losses.
Yes, many established socialist and social democratic parties suffered significant electoral defeats during this period. The source mentions UK Labour, the German SPD, the French Socialists as examples. And then came the huge intellectual and psychological blow of the collapse of communism in 1989-91.
Why was that so damaging to social democracy? They weren't communists.
True, but the collapse damaged the credibility of all forms of socialism, simply by association in the public mind. More importantly, it seemed to remove the only significant non-capitalist alternative system from the global stage, making market capitalism appear triumphant and inevitable. It also undermined faith in what the sociologist Anthony Giddens called the cybernetic model of social change, the idea of the state acting as a central brain or control mechanism, capable of planning and implementing large-scale social and economic reforms from the top down.
Because state planning failed in the East.
Precisely. And in retrospect, some critics argued that even Keynesian social democracy, with its emphasis on state management and intervention, was just a milder, less extreme version of the same kind of top-down state socialism that had been so decisively rejected in Eastern Europe.
So all these pressures, economic crisis, electoral decline, the fall of communism led to yet another wave of rethinking and revisionism within social democracy, sometimes called neo-revisionism, or more famously, the third way.
Exactly. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating in the 90s, many reformist parties in the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, Australia, New Zealand, among others, began consciously moving away from the tenets of traditional post-war social democracy.
And they use different labels.
Yes, various labels were used. New social democracy, the third way, popularized by Tony Blair's New Labour in the UK and Bill Clinton in the US, though Clinton wasn't technically a socialist. The radical center, the active center, the New Mitte, New Center in Germany under Gerhard Schroeder.
And what did this third way actually stand for? It claimed to be an alternative to both old socialism and neoliberalism.
That was the core claim, yes.
Yeah.
To find a path that navigated between what they saw as the outdated statism of old-style social democracy and the harsh individualism and market fundamentalism of neoliberalism. The source rightly notes, however, that the term third way itself remained rather imprecise and covered a range of different national adaptations.
But were there some common characteristic themes the source identifies?
Yes, several key themes emerge. First, and perhaps most foundational, was an explicit acceptance that socialism, understood as top-down state intervention and comprehensive public ownership on the old model, was effectively dead. There was seen to be no viable alternative to a dynamic market economy.
Accepting capitalism, basically.
Accepting market capitalism as the essential engine of wealth creation. You saw this symbolized in UK labor rewriting its Clause the Fourth. There was also an acceptance of globalization as an irreversible reality and an understanding of the modern economy as an information society or knowledge economy. So the third way was generally pro-market, pro-business, aiming to work with the grain of the neoliberal revolution of the 80s and 90s, rather than trying to reverse it entirely.
Okay, embrace the market. What else?
Second, there was a strong rhetorical emphasis on community and moral responsibility. This drew consciously on socialism's communitarian heritage. While accepting neoliberal economics to a large extent, third-way thinkers often critiqued its potential moral and social downsides, arguing that untrammeled market fundamentalism could erode social cohesion and traditional values.
So, market economics, but with social conscience.
Something like that. Some versions explicitly tried to fuse communitarian ideas, emphasizing shared values and obligations, with liberal ideas, emphasizing individual rights, creating something the source calls communitarian liberalism, which actually echoes the new liberalism of the late 19th century. A cornerstone of this was the idea that rights and responsibilities are intrinsically linked. It promoted a kind of new individualism, one that stressed individual autonomy, but situated it within a framework of social interdependence and mutual obligation.
Interesting blend. Third theme?
Third, the third way tended towards a consensus view of society, which contrasted sharply with traditional socialism's focus on class conflict. The heavy emphasis on community served to highlight the ties that bind people together, often downplaying or glossing over underlying class differences and economic inequalities. This consensus approach was reflected in what the source calls a non-dualistic worldview. Third-way politics often endorsed seemingly opposing values simultaneously: enterprise and fairness, opportunity and security, self-reliance and interdependence, trying to appeal to everyone.
Trying to bridge divides. Okay, fourth theme.
Now, fourth, there was a clear shift in focus from traditional socialist goals of equality of outcome towards social inclusion. The language shifted towards more liberal concepts like equality of opportunity and meritocracy. Egalitarianism was significantly scaled down. Instead of aiming for similar economic outcomes, the goal became ensuring everyone had access to the opportunities and assets needed to fulfill their potential, sometimes called asset-based egalitarianism. This meant focusing on things like education and skills training. Welfare reform was also central here. The third way rejected both the perceived harshness of neoliberal sink-or-swim individualism and the perceived dependency culture of old social democratic cradle-to-grave welfare.
So what was the alternative?
Welfare became more targeted, focusing on helping the socially excluded reintegrate into society, primarily through work. The mantra became helping people to help themselves, providing a hand up, not a handout, as Bill Clinton famously put it. This often involved linking welfare benefits much more closely to the obligation to seek work or undertake training policies, often labeled workfare. The emphasis was on promoting self-reliance within a supportive framework.
And the fifth theme relates to the state's role.
Yes. The fifth theme involved redefining the role of the state itself. Instead of the old interventionist or welfare state, the third way envisaged what's sometimes called a competition state or a market state.
What does that mean?
Its primary goal became ensuring national prosperity and competitiveness in the new global economy. The main focus of state activity shifted toward social investment, particularly investing in the nation's infrastructure and, crucially, in the skills and knowledge of its workforce. Education became the top priority, often valued more for its contribution to national economic competitiveness and individual employability, a rather utilitarian or classical liberal view, than for personal development or critical thinking, more modern liberal or traditional socialist views. The government was seen less as an economic engineer and more as a cultural actor, shaping the attitudes, values, and skills needed for citizens and the nation to succeed in the global marketplace.
Wow, that's quite a shift from traditional socialism. And the source again provides that really useful comparative box, laying out the key differences between classic social democracy and this third way approach side by side.
Yes, it's very clear.
It highlights tensions like ideological commitment versus pragmatism, a focus on the nation-state versus embracing globalization, class politics versus community rhetoric, managing a mixed economy versus promoting the market economy, aiming for full employment versus aiming for full employability, universal welfare versus targeted social inclusion. That box visually captures the significant evolution or maybe retreat for you listening. So we've traced this long evolution, the series of revisions and adaptations. Where does all this leave socialism as an ideology in our current global age? Given the collapse of communism and the transformation, some might say dilution, of social democracy into the third way, is it fair to conclude, as some observers do, that socialism is simply dead, killed off by globalization?
That's certainly one perspective the source discusses. The argument goes that globalization played a key role in socialism's decline across the board. It suggests, for instance, that globalization helped accelerate the collapse of orthodox communism by bolstering Western economic growth, widening the material gap between East and West, and allowing Western media and values to penetrate the Iron Curtain, fueling dissent and the eventual revolutions.
And it undermines social democracy, too.
Yes, the argument continues that globalization also fundamentally undermined traditional social democracy. The old model of national Keynesianism, managing a national economy within its borders, became increasingly obsolete as national governments lost much of their capacity to control economic factors like capital flows, investment decisions, and even wages due to deepening global economic integration.
Less control for national governments.
Much less. Furthermore, the intensified global competition put downward pressure on governments everywhere. They felt compelled to cut corporate taxes to attract investment, reduce public spending to appear fiscally responsible, reform welfare states to make them affordable, and promote labor market flexibility to compete internationally. These pressures pushed social democratic parties steadily towards more market-friendly, less traditionally egalitarian policies.
So the third way was just bowing to the inevitable.
From this critical perspective, yes. Mere revisionism, or the third way, is seen essentially as an accommodation, even a surrender, to these powerful global economic forces. If globalization is seen as an irresistible tide, intrinsically linked to neoliberal market principles, then socialism, in its traditional forms at least, does indeed seem doomed, perhaps consigned, as Trotsky once famously said of his opponents, to the dustbin of history.
That sounds incredibly bleak for anyone who still holds socialist ideals. But the source doesn't entirely end on that note, does it? It offers a slightly more hopeful perspective, or at least a counter-argument.
It does. It suggests that socialists who take a longer historical view might be less despondent. History, after all, is littered with failed predictions about the end of ideology, or the permanent triumph of one particular system.
Like when liberalism seemed finished.
Exactly. As the source points out, back in the 1960s, it was often argued that free market liberalism was outdated and redundant, while socialism, in its various forms, seemed to be the rising force globally. So, things can change. The hope for socialism's continued relevance, the source suggests, rests perhaps on the enduring and perhaps intrinsic imperfections of capitalism itself.
Capitalism creates problems that socialism can still address.
That's the idea. The source quotes Ralph Miliband, a prominent Marxist scholar, writing in his 1995 book Socialism for a Skeptical Age. Miliband called the notion that capitalism, even in its reformed state, represents the best possible social system humanity can achieve, a dreadful slur on the human race. In this view, even if traditional socialist models have failed or faded, socialism survives, perhaps primarily as an ethical critique, a persistent reminder that human development and societal organization can, and maybe should, aspire to something beyond market individualism and the relentless pursuit of private profit.
So maybe globalization isn't just the challenge that killed off old socialism, but also potentially a new context or even an opportunity for socialist ideas to re-emerge in a different form.
The source certainly floats this possibility, just as capitalism itself is being profoundly transformed by its increasingly transnational global dimension. Perhaps socialism is also capable of transforming itself into a relevant critique of global exploitation, global inequality, and the global problems generated by unregulated markets.
Socialism goes global too.
In a sense, the source argues, counterintuitively perhaps, that socialism might actually be particularly well positioned to make sense of the new global age, precisely because socialist thinkers, especially Marxists, have a long history of recognizing and analyzing capitalism's inherent transnational tendencies.
Marx talked about globalization.
In effect, yes. Marx and Engels can be seen as perhaps the earliest theorists of economic globalization. Way back in the Communist Manifesto, they vividly described capitalism's relentless drive to batter down all Chinese walls, to overcome national barriers and conquer the whole earth for its market. They saw this global expansionism as built into capitalism's DNA.
And Lenin, too.
Yes, Lenin, in his theory of imperialism, also saw capitalism fundamentally as an international system. He argued that imperialism, the drive for colonial expansion, was economically driven by the need for mature capitalist economies to export surplus capital overseas to find new, more profitable investment opportunities.
Those earlier socialist insights about capitalism's global reach do seem incredibly relevant today when you look at multinational corporations, complex global supply chains, international financial flows.
They really do resonate, don't they? And indeed, Marxist and neo-Marxist theories continue to be used today to analyze and critique the power structures, asymmetries, and deepening divisions within the modern global system.
Like world systems theory.
Exactly. The source mentions world systems theory, associated with Immanuel Wallerstein. This theory views the entire global economy as a single, interlocking capitalist system that essentially mirrors, on a global scale, the inequalities, exploitation, and instabilities seen within national capitalism. It divides the world into a dominant core, the developed North, which extracts surplus from and exploits a dependent periphery, the less developed South, trapping the periphery in a state of underdevelopment.
And this kind of analysis has had influence.
Yes, this critical analysis of global inequality and injustice was a major influence on the anti-globalization, or what often calls itself the anti-capitalist, movement that gained significant visibility from the 1990s onwards, protesting against institutions like the WTO, IMF, and World Bank, and challenging the dominant narrative of neoliberal globalization.
But that anti-capitalism movement itself is quite broad and diverse, isn't it? It's not like a single, unified socialist force marching under one banner.
The source definitely makes that crucial point. It's described as a very diverse ideological stance, perhaps more of a coalition or a network, primarily united by its opposition to neoliberal globalization and its attempt to give voice to marginalized groups and alternative perspectives. But it lacks a single, systematic critique of capitalism comparable to traditional Marxism, or a clearly unified vision of what a desirable alternative future would look like.
So different motivations within it.
Absolutely. While some activists within the movement undoubtedly draw on Marxist analysis and might aim for a post-capitalist future, others might simply seek to reform capitalism, to remove its worst excesses through things like fairer trade rules, debt relief, or environmental regulations. And many involved are perhaps driven more by a general ethical striving for a better world, for more justice and sustainability, without adhering to any specific, fully articulated socialist ideology.
So the source kind of leaves us hanging with that big question. Can socialism, perhaps in some new adapted form, be reborn or find renewed relevance as a critique of or alternative to global capitalism in the 21st century? Can it adapt once again to the challenges and realities of a new historical era, or has its moment truly passed? It's an open question.
It really is. We've covered such a vast sweep of ideas today, haven't we? Tracing socialism all the way from its Latin linguistic roots and its birth as a powerful reaction against the harshness of early industrial capitalism. Exploring the starkly different revolutionary and evolutionary paths it took across the globe, and diving deep into its core values that emphasis on community, cooperation, equality, the role of class politics, and its distinctive views on ownership.
Yeah, and we've really seen the deep divisions and ongoing debates within socialism itself. It's not one thing. The contrast between, say, communism's radical push for absolute equality and total state control versus social democracy's more pragmatic goal of reforming and humanizing capitalism through welfare and redistribution.
And then the further evolution, or some might say dilution, into the third ways complex, perhaps contradictory, stance trying to balance markets, community responsibility, and social inclusion. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And we've considered how this incredibly influential ideology, which faced such significant challenges and setbacks in the late 20th century with the fall of communism and the rise of neoliberalism, might now, perhaps, find new relevance or a new voice in critiquing the inequalities and exploitations generated by 21st century global capitalism, potentially transforming itself yet again in response to the pressures of globalization.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that ideologies aren't static museum pieces. They are living, breathing, evolving sets of ideas that split, adapt, argue, and are constantly being redefined by historical events, by new social and economic challenges, and by the ongoing struggles and debates of those who champion them in different times and places.
Absolutely, a dynamic process.
So maybe a final thought for you listening to consider. Given this long historical journey we've traced, all the internal debates and transformations, the successes and the failures, and thinking about the current global landscape, what aspects of socialist thought, if any, do you find remain most compelling, or perhaps most relevant, for understanding or potentially addressing the complex problems facing the world you see right now? Something to mull over.
That's a great question to end on. Thank you so much for providing the source material for this deep dive. We really hope this exploration gives you, our listener, a much richer, more nuanced, and clearer picture of the many, many facets of socialism than you might have had before. It's certainly complex.
It definitely is complex. We really enjoyed unpacking it all with you. Until our next deep dive.